China and Russia have long touted their so-called no-limits partnership, but that promise now appears to be unraveling into a no-limits betrayal. In a shocking move, Russia has imposed a 55% tariff on Chinese automobiles and metallurgical products. Why would President Vladimir Putin choose this moment to slap tariffs on Beijing? Is he signaling submission to former President Donald Trump? But before we begin our analysis, we invite you to like and subscribe to WorldView Today for our most unique and insightful takes on global affairs. The crumbling Sino-Russian bond. For President Xi Jinping, China is in a precarious position. Domestically, the economy is faltering, and internationally, nations that have reached trade agreements with the U.S. are increasingly erecting tariff walls against Chinese imports. For a time, Xi's closest ally seemed to be Putin. The two leaders appeared inseparable. But a report from Epoch Times China edition on April 11th reveals that Russia has now imposed steep tariffs on Chinese metallurgical goods and auto parts. The reason? Russia can no longer withstand China's dumping practices. In recent years, Chinese exports to Russia have surged. In 2023, bilateral trade between the two nations reached 240 billion yuan. Affordable, performance-efficient Chinese products have flooded Russian markets, squeezing out local companies. In just 2 years, Chinese cars have taken over more than 60% of the Russian auto market, up from less than 10% in 2021, pushing domestic manufacturers to the brink of collapse. A message to Trump? Russia runs a growing trade deficit with China, while China enjoys a surplus. So, balancing this relationship economically might seem logical, but the timing raises eyebrows. Why now? One interpretation: Putin could be signaling alignment with Donald Trump. Trump is furious with China. Meanwhile, Putin has hesitated to agree to Trump's proposed Ukraine ceasefire terms. Imposing tariffs on China might be a strategic move to ease tensions with Trump. This brings us to the ongoing Russia-Ukraine ceasefire negotiations. Trump's peace envoys and a divided Ukraine. Trump has appointed two special envoys, Mr. Witkoff for the Middle East and Mr. Koch for the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Recently, Witkoff visited Moscow for the third time, holding a 4-hour meeting with Putin. While the meeting publicly focused on the Middle East, key discussions centered around Ukraine. Putin reportedly clarified that if the U.S. attacks Iran, Russia will remain neutral, a signal that might allow the U.S. to act with less fear of escalation. More critically, Koch proposed a controversial idea: partitioning Ukraine, similarly to Berlin post-World War II. Under this plan, eastern Ukraine, currently occupied by Russia, would fall under Russian control. Western Ukraine would be split into British and French zones of responsibility, using the Dnieper River as a demarcation line. A 30-kilometer buffer zone would be established along the front line to allow satellite surveillance and prevent blame games in case of ceasefire violations. The aim is not to divide Ukraine permanently, but to establish zones of military responsibility, echoing the Cold War strategy in Berlin. However, this proposal sparked criticism, as many initially feared Ukraine would be carved up among foreign powers. Stalemate and growing European resolve. Currently, Russia only controls less than half of the 4 key regions in eastern Ukraine it claims: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. Further Russian advances would be unacceptable to Kyiv. Meanwhile, frustration in Ukraine is growing toward Washington. On April 11th, U.S. and Ukrainian officials met to discuss a proposed minerals deal, but tensions were high and hopes for progress were slim. Europe is increasingly stepping up. At a recent 50-nation Ukraine Defense Contact Group summit, the UK and Norway pledged a military aid package worth over $580 million, including drones, radar, and anti-tank systems. Germany announced an additional $11 billion in military aid through 2029, bringing total commitments to a record $21 billion. The message to Putin is clear: the more he escalates, the more united Europe becomes. The shadow of China in Ukraine, China's role is growing more controversial. Despite earlier reluctance to openly arm Russia, Ukraine recently claimed that 155 Chinese soldiers are actively assisting Russian forces. Their identities and interviews were even broadcast on Ukrainian television. This revelation seems intended to pressure Washington to block Chinese support or risk an endless war. This is part of a broader geopolitical chessboard involving the US, China, Russia, and Europe, with implications for Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and beyond. Trump's tariff strategy, pressuring allies to isolate China. Trump's economic playbook involves reducing tariffs for allies while imposing steep ones on China. His administration collected over $410 billion in duties through a baseline 10% tariff applied to imports worth $4.1 trillion. Additional tariffs, some up to 100%, were used as leverage in negotiations. For example, Vietnam offered to crack down on transshipped Chinese goods in exchange for tariff reductions. Each country could strike a different deal, but all were incentivized to align with the US over China. The underlying logic: most nations suffer from China's dumping practices. When Trump raises barriers, he doesn't lose allies. He empowers them to build their own. Like a flood wall, America's tariffs force other countries to construct their own defenses, aligning them with Washington. China's export crisis and the manufacturing trap. China can't pivot away from its factory of the world model overnight. Decades of overproduction, government subsidies, and underpriced goods have created global dependency. But that same dependency now acts as a trap. US-China trade is declining. If tariffs remain at 100%, exports could fall by 90% in 2025. The result: not inflation, but deflation. As unsold goods pile up, prices drop, and consumers tighten spending amid worsening economic prospects. China risks returning to a pre-WTO era, where bilateral trade is minimal and only essential goods cross borders. Putin-Xi alliance at a breaking point. Can Trump break the Dragon Bear alliance? His current team is composed of foreign policy hawks, determined to isolate China even if it means driving a wedge between Beijing and Moscow. Just as Nixon visited China in the 1970s to counterbalance the USSR, Trump may court Russia to contain China today. The problem for Xi is that China's economy is slowing, energy demand is down, and China can't bail out Russia. Despite their long border, economic ties between the two remain weak. Russia's population and industry are based in Europe. China's are along the southeastern coast. Their industrial cores face opposite directions. In truth, the Sino-Russian border is a no-man's land, sparsely populated and economically irrelevant. Both countries have declining interest in each other. If Trump can offer Russia an alternative to China for energy exports, the China-Russia alliance could collapse, just like the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s. A century of repetition? Historically, every time China's relationship with Russia deteriorated, Beijing underwent profound internal change within 3 to 4 years. In the early 1900s, after the Boxer Rebellion and Treaty of Hsinchu, Russia seized Manchuria, prompting Qing China to secretly support Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. In the 1960s, after the Jinbao Island clashes, tensions peaked and eventually led to the downfall of Lin Biao and Mao Zedong's pivot to reconcile with the US in 1972. The question now is, will 2025 mark the third great split?